I didn't notice the cat at first. The alley behind my house was the kind of place that never attracted much attention. Just a narrow strip of pavement lined with dumpsters, the occasional piece of litter caught in the wind, and the stale scent of old garbage. It was the kind of space that felt forgotten, wedged between two buildings like a discarded thought. So when I started seeing the cat, I thought little of it. The first time I spotted it was in the early morning. I was taking out the trash, trying to rush back inside before the workday began. The cat was sitting by the edge of a dumpster, still as a statue. Its fur was a dull gray, like soot, and its eyes, an unnatural shade of green, fixed on me with a quiet intensity. I paused, unsure if I should approach or leave it alone. It looked hungry, but not malnourished. Strays were common enough in this neighborhood. I figured someone else must have been feeding it, or it was living off the scraps from the dumpster. I went back inside without giving it much thought, but the cat kept appearing. Every morning when I left the house for work, it was there, sitting in the same spot, its eyes following me as I moved through the alley. There was something deliberate in the way it watched me, not like the casual glance of an animal used to human presence. No, this felt more pointed, as though the cat expected something from me. After a few days of this, I decided to give it some food. There was leftover chicken in my fridge, not quite spoiled, but close enough that I didn't want it. I wrapped the pieces in a napkin and brought them out to the alley. The cat was there, as usual, watching me intently. When I crouched down and set the food on the ground, it didn't move. I waited a few moments, feeling a bit foolish as I stood there, hunched in front of a stray cat that seemed more curious than hungry. Then, slowly, the cat rose from its spot. It walked toward the food with a measured, almost deliberate pace and began to eat, never taking its eyes off me. I couldn't help but smile a little. There was something odd about the cat, but it wasn't anything I could put into words. Just a feeling, nothing I hadn't felt around animals before. They had their own way of making you feel like they understood things in a way humans didn't. For a while, that became our routine. I'd leave food out in the alley for it, scraps from dinner, sometimes canned tuna if I remembered to pick it up. The cat was always waiting, never coming too close, but never straying too far either. I started calling it Gray, though it never gave any indication it recognized the name. And that was fine. There wasn't anything strange about a stray cat hanging around. Maybe I was just imagining the way it stared at me. There was nothing unusual about an animal being cautious. It wasn't until a couple of weeks into this routine that I noticed something that gave me pause. It had been raining the night before, the kind of steady downpour that left the ground slick and muddy. When I brought out food for Gray that morning, I saw something odd. The cat was sitting in its usual spot, dry despite the lingering dampness in the air. That wasn't what struck me, though. It was the ground around it. The entire alley was marked with puddles, muddy footprints, and tire tracks from the garbage truck that had passed through earlier. But where Gray sat, the ground was untouched. No paw prints, no sign that the cat had moved through the mud at all. I frowned, staring at the space around it. Maybe I was imagining it. I knelt down to place the food on the ground, glancing at the dirt beneath me. There were my own footprints, clear and deep in the mud, but nothing from the cat. Gray just watched me, eyes as steady as ever, waiting for me to leave before approaching the food. I tried to shake off the unease that crept in, telling myself it didn't matter. Cats were light on their feet, after all. Maybe it just avoided the mud somehow, stepping carefully between the puddles. But the thought lingered. The next day, and the day after, I began to pay closer attention. The same thing kept happening. No paw prints, no evidence that the cat had moved through the alley. It wasn't until I told a friend about it, offhandedly over drinks one night, that I realized how strange it actually was. He looked at me, a bit bemused, and asked how a stray cat could possibly avoid leaving tracks, especially in the mud. I didn't have an answer. That weekend, I decided to take a closer look. There was nothing wrong with being curious, after all. On Saturday morning, I stood at my kitchen window watching the alley. Gray was there, sitting in its usual spot, staring at the door like it knew I was about to come out. I stepped outside with some food, but instead of leaving it at the usual spot, I placed it further down the alley. I wanted to see how it moved. The cat rose, as it always did, but this time I watched it carefully. It walked toward the food, and again there were no tracks. Its paws moved through the mud, but the ground beneath them stayed undisturbed, like it wasn't really touching the earth at all. I couldn't explain it. That night, I lay awake, replaying the scene in my head. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe there was something I was missing, something simple that would explain it all. But I couldn't stop thinking about those green eyes, the way they seemed to hold me in place, like the cat was studying me just as much as I was studying it. And that's when I began to realize that Gray wasn't just another stray cat. There was something more to it, something I didn't yet understand, but could feel tugging at the edges of my mind, waiting for me to see what had been in front of me all along. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my distance from Gray. It wasn't that I was afraid of the cat. It had never been aggressive, never so much as hissed or clawed at me, but that lingering feeling of unease had settled deeper in my mind. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what was at the root of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I kept feeding it, I'd be inviting something into my life that I wouldn't be able to ignore. Still, Gray kept showing up. Every morning, every evening, sitting in the same spot in the alley like nothing had changed. If I didn't bring out food, it would sit there quietly, just staring. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just a stray cat, that it would move on eventually, find someone else's doorstep to haunt. But no matter how much I wanted to believe that, something held me back from fully convincing myself. On the third day of trying to avoid it, I found myself standing at the back door with the food again. The plate of scraps felt heavier in my hands than usual, as if my decision to feed the cat again was a reluctant surrender. I stepped outside, and there was Gray, waiting as always, still and watchful. This time, I didn't place the food far away. I set it down right in front of me, just a few feet away from the cat, and waited. Gray's eyes never left mine as it stood and walked toward the plate. Again, no paw prints in the dirt. It moved in that slow, deliberate way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the space between us was shrinking in more than just a physical sense. I felt like I was being drawn in, caught in a web of something I couldn't see. The cat ate in silence, and for the first time, I noticed that its jaws didn't make any sound. No crunch of bones, no tearing of flesh, not even the soft clink of its teeth against the plate. I watched for a long time. There was something almost ritualistic about the way it ate. Like this wasn't just about sustenance, but something deeper, more purposeful. When it finished, it sat down, staring at me again, as if waiting for something. I didn't know what. I decided to leave it there and head back inside, but as I turned to go, I heard something that made me freeze. A voice, soft but unmistakable, came from behind me. "Thank you." I spun around, my heart racing, but the alley was empty except for the cat. Gray was sitting in the same spot, looking up at me with those green eyes. For a moment, I was convinced I'd imagined it. I had to have. Cats don't speak. But I knew what I'd heard. I couldn't explain it, but it had happened. I stood there staring at Gray, trying to figure out what was happening. The cat blinked slowly, a gesture I'd always read as contentment, but now it felt different, more like it was acknowledging me. The voice hadn't sounded like mine, but it had a strange familiarity to it. Not like a stranger speaking, but like hearing something you've forgotten from long ago, resurfacing in the present. I didn't know what to do. I felt like if I stayed any longer, something else would happen, something I wasn't ready for. So I turned and walked back inside, shutting the door firmly behind me. Over the next few nights, I avoided the alley altogether. I stopped feeding Gray, stopped looking out the back window. But that didn't stop the feeling of being watched. Even when I sat in the living room with all the blinds drawn, I could feel those eyes on me, as though the cat was still there, waiting. On the 5th night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, coming from the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animal outside. Raccoons were common enough in the area. But when I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. But the scratching didn't stop. It continued, steady and persistent, until I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and walked slowly to the back door, the noise growing louder as I approached. My hand hesitated on the door handle for a moment before I opened it. The alley was empty. There was no sign of Gray, no movement, nothing. But the scratching sound had stopped the moment I opened the door, as if whatever had been making it knew I was there. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to happen, but the alley stayed silent. I almost turned to go back inside when I noticed something on the ground near the door. It was small, barely visible in the dim light. A tuft of gray fur. Gray's fur. My breath caught as I bent down to pick it up, the soft strands slipping between my fingers. It shouldn't have meant anything. Cats shed all the time, but this felt different. I stood up and glanced around the alley again, half expecting to see the cat watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the empty space and the distant hum of the city beyond. When I went back inside, I left the door unlocked, for reasons I couldn't quite explain. It was a small thing, and yet it felt significant, like I was opening myself up to something I didn't fully understand. The next morning, Gray was waiting for me again. But this time, something had changed. There was no food left for it, no offering from me. But it didn't seem to mind. It just sat there, looking at me with those green eyes, as though it had all the time in the world. I found myself staring back, feeling like I was on the edge of something, like the space between us was shrinking again. But this time there was no turning back. And then, without warning, Gray stood up and walked away, disappearing down the alley out of sight. The day Gray walked away, I felt an unexpected relief. It was like some unseen tension had been pulled taut between us, and its sudden departure snapped that thread. I went about my day, convinced it had finally lost interest in me, that it would move on and find another place to haunt. The alley remained quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't consumed by thoughts of the cat. But the relief didn't last. That night, as I sat on the couch watching some mindless TV show, a nagging sense of wrongness settled over me. It was the kind of feeling that clings to the back of your thoughts, subtle at first, then slowly pushing its way into the forefront until you can't focus on anything else. The noise from the television became muffled, distant, as if it wasn't even meant for me. Something wasn't right. I turned off the TV and listened. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual hum of the city outside, the occasional car passing by, the creak of the old building. But then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard it. The scratching. It was the same as before, steady, rhythmic, insistent. But this time, it wasn't coming from the back door. It was coming from inside. I stood up slowly, straining to pinpoint the source. The sound was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was like something was scraping against the walls, moving through the house with a quiet persistence. I took a few tentative steps toward the hallway, my breath catching in my throat as I listened. The scratching seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the walls themselves were alive with the noise. I moved through the house, checking each room, but found nothing. The sound seemed to shift, always staying just out of reach, leading me in circles. By the time I reached the back of the house, I realized where it was coming from. The basement. I hadn't been down there in weeks. It was mostly storage, old boxes, forgotten furniture, things I didn't need but couldn't bring myself to throw away. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly cracked open, though I was certain I'd left it closed. The scratching noise was louder now, more distinct, coming from below. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob. There was no reason for the noise to be coming from the basement. Nothing lived down there, not even pests, as far as I knew. But the sound was real, and it was calling to me in a way I couldn't ignore. I opened the door. The basement stairs stretched into darkness, the faint light from the hallway barely reaching the bottom. The scratching continued, echoing up from below, steady and relentless. I grabbed the flashlight from the shelf by the door and flicked it on. At first, I didn't see anything. The basement looked as it always had, dusty, cluttered, untouched. But the scratching persisted, louder now, like it was right beneath me. I took a step down, then another, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The sound grew more distinct as I descended, coming from the far corner of the room where old boxes were stacked high against the wall. The moment I reached the bottom, the scratching stopped. I froze, shining the flashlight around the room. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment I stood there, waiting for something to happen, for the noise to return, for anything that would make sense of this strange feeling that had gripped me. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, just beneath one of the old shelves, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, a blur in the dim light. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was fur, gray and matted, pressed against the wall like it was trying to merge with the darkness. Gray. It was impossible. The door had been locked all night, and I hadn't seen the cat since it disappeared down the alley. Yet here it was, crouched in the corner of my basement, watching me with those familiar green eyes. But something was wrong. Its fur was patchy, thinning in places, and its body looked smaller, frailer, as though it had been starving for days. The cat's eyes, however, were the same, bright and sharp, locked on me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the intruder. I crouched down slowly, my flashlight trained on the cat. "Gray?" I whispered, though I wasn't expecting a response. The cat blinked once, then stood up, its movements slow and deliberate, just as they always had been. But there was something about the way it moved now that set my teeth on edge. It didn't look like it was walking. It looked like it was being pulled forward, its legs moving stiffly, unnaturally. I backed away, my hand tightening around the flashlight. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The floor around Gray was covered in scratches. Deep, uneven marks gouged into the concrete, as though something had been frantically clawing at the ground for hours. The scratches formed a strange, spiraling pattern, almost deliberate, like they were meant to be read, but I couldn't make sense of them. And then, in the quiet, I heard it again. The voice. Only this time, it wasn't behind me. It came from Gray. "Help me." The words were faint, barely more than a rasp, but they were unmistakable. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I stared at the cat. It didn't move. It just stood there, eyes fixed on me, as if waiting for me to respond. But how could I? My mind was racing, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. Cats don't speak. This couldn't be happening. I wanted to turn and run, to get as far away from the basement as I could. But something kept me rooted in place, some pull I couldn't explain. Gray took a step forward, and then another, until it was only a few feet away from me. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something unseen had filled the space between us. I took a step back, and as I did, Gray stopped moving. It sat down, its eyes never leaving mine, and for the first time, I felt like I understood. This wasn't about the cat. It never had been. The scratches on the floor, the voice, the strange feeling of being watched, it wasn't coming from Gray. It was coming from something else, something that had been using the cat to reach me. But what? I didn't have an answer. Not then. But I knew in that moment that whatever had been watching me through Gray's eyes had finally found its way inside. The scratching started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from me. As I stood there in the basement, the flashlight flickering in my trembling hand, the realization settled over me slowly. Could it be? Gray hadn't just been a stray cat. It was a vessel. It had never been about the food. It had been about me. And with the cat gone, I knew it had found exactly what it had been searching for. Me.